I'm Jake. I'm the creative director here at Alpine Church, and I'm glad to be here today with all of you. I hope you're having a good morning. Dave already did the, hey, come on, give me a real good morning, so I won't make you say it again. But today we're talking about Three's Company. That's right. Talking about John Ritter, Suzanne Summers, and is it Joanne DeWitt? Joyce DeWitt? I can't remember her name. The show was canceled like 8 years before I was born, so I'm sorry. No, we're not talking about that, actually. We're actually talking about the original Three's Company, Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. We've been, in our series, we've been following the life of Abraham, and to catch you up on the story, Abraham was an old man, a regular guy, and God said, leave the land of your father and mother, and go to the land that I will show you. And so Abraham uproots his life, and he says, okay, and he goes to this land, and it's said that he worshiped God, and he made altars, and he was on the right track. And God had made a promise to him and said, I will make you into a great nation. Now the only problem is, like I said, he was an old man. His wife was an old woman, and they had not had any kids. And I think at that point they probably didn't plan to have any kids. The next week we see that a famine drives them down into Egypt, and Abraham is scared because his wife Sarah is a beautiful woman, and he says, tell them that you're my sister, and that way they won't kill me and take you from me. And so they go down there and they meet Pharaoh, and they say that she is his sister, and Pharaoh takes her anyway. And then Pharaoh finds out, and it turns out he's the guy with some real integrity. He said, why would you let me take your wife as my wife? And he says, go, I want nothing to do with you guys, get out of here. And he was sorry that he ever did it. And we see kind of this low point in Abraham's story because obviously you shouldn't allow pharaohs to take your wife as their own. So last week we saw that it's years down the road and they're still waiting. They're back in God's land, and Abraham is curious as to when God is going to get his plan going. And he asks him again, he says, are you really going to do this? And God says, look to the stars. That's why I love our image, if I can go back here. He says, look to the stars, and that's how many descendants I'll give you. And he reassures Abraham, and it says that Abraham believed him, and he was counted as righteous because of his faith. And there God makes a covenant with him. But the interesting thing about this covenant is that it was a one-sided covenant. Abraham, in this weird ceremony where they had these butchered animals among them, God was supposed to do his part, and Abraham was supposed to do his, but God was the only one that did his part. And he was showing Abraham that it doesn't matter what you do, I'm going to be faithful, and I'm going to hold up my end of the bargain, and I'm going to keep my promise. And so we pick up the story today, and Abraham and Sarah are still waiting. And this is the first thing we learn here, that waiting on God is no easy thing. Now for some of you, you're probably like, yep, you're right. Some of you feel like you've been waiting on God for a long time to fulfill a promise that his word gives us. Maybe you've been waiting on strength in a tough situation. You feel like you can't bear it any longer, and you're waiting for God's strength to meet you. Maybe you've been wronged by some people in your life, and you're waiting on God's justice. Maybe you're in a hairy situation, you don't know which way you should go or what you should do, and you're waiting on some wisdom or some discernment. Maybe you're caught up in an addiction, and you're waiting for God to give you the self-control and the freedom to break that addiction. Or maybe you're just looking for some direction in life. Maybe you don't know what you should be doing next. You know, when I graduated college years ago, not that many years ago, but years ago, my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, Zoe, her path was clear. She was going to go to New York, and she was going to start her master's program, and it was a 2-year program, and I was going to apply for jobs. and start my career. And my job, or my degree, gave me a lot of freedom. I could go in a lot of different directions, and I wasn't sure which direction I wanted to go. And I was applying for jobs here. I was applying for jobs in New York. I didn't know if I was going to stay here, if I was going to go there with Zoe. And I wasn't getting a lot of success. I wasn't getting a lot of callbacks. And for 3 months, I applied for jobs, and I felt like I was waiting on God to give me some type of direction, to give me some result, some kind of open door, so I could at least know what my options were. Now, for 3 months, maybe some of you have been waiting on God for much, much longer than that. Maybe you're thinking 3 months is easy mode. Well, at this point in the story, they've been waiting for 10 years, Abraham and Sarah. We're led to believe that they were unable to have kids in their youth. They were 85 and 75 now. And you can imagine, after God had given this promise to them, that they were pretty excited. I mean, they had never had the opportunity to be parents. Everyone else around them's having kids, and finally, God is promising that they're going to have the same opportunity. You know, they probably took Abraham's office and converted it to the baby's room, and he was probably glad to do it. But after 10 years, you can imagine they're probably losing hope. And last week, we see him questioning God and saying, "When is this really going to happen?" You know, to make things worse, in their day back then, it was considered a curse to be without children. People looked at you and said, "This is your fault. You must have done something wrong, and now God's cursing you because of it." So rather than feeling hopeful, rather than feeling excited and expectant, they're most likely feeling pretty down and cursed and hopeless. And so at this point, Sarah has had enough. She's done waiting, and she's willing to take things into her own hands. So she hatches a plan, and we're going to see here that deciding to be your own deliverer is a dangerous game. See, when we're waiting on God, it's really, really tempting sometimes to want to take it into our own hands. It's really tempting to try and expedite the process or cut corners. I mean, we're kind of in the age of instant gratification. Like, if you want warm food, you just pop it in the microwave, and it's ready to go in 2 minutes. I mean, that's pretty incredible. You know you had to use a stove before? And before that, a campfire? I mean, that's pretty crazy. I steal my parents' Amazon Prime account, and I can get whatever I want in 2 days on my porch. I don't even use normal shipping anymore. It's too slow. You know, if I have a question, I can go to the internet, and I can have a wealth of knowledge, the history of the world's knowledge, in seconds. I mean, we live in an age of instant gratification. I mean, how many of us, when you go to the elevator, do you hit the call button, and then you wait a couple seconds, and the magic box that takes you into the sky is going too slow, so you hit the button some more, as if that's going to make any difference? Because we want it, and we want it now. My wife, when she gets into the elevator, this isn't really that pertinent, but I just want to complain about my wife. When she gets into the elevator, she hits her floor, and then she just goes crazy on the close the door button. It's going to save her half a second. All right, so all these things, these things that give us instant gratification, I mean, they're not bad. These are all good things. But it conditions us to want something and to want it now. And so when God promises certain things, and we feel like you're just waiting on God to come through, it's really tempting to say, "God, I want it now." And when God's timing isn't the same as our timing, it's also really tempting to want to take it into our own hands. And so that's where Sarah is today. And so she hatches a plan. So let's take a look in Genesis 16. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abraham, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abraham agreed with Sarah's proposal. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian servant and gave her to Abraham as a wife. So this is her brilliant plan. Abraham is going to sleep with her servant. Now, this isn't super uncommon for the time. It was actually kind of the expected thing to do. If you were unable to have kids, and you had a servant, you would use that servant as a surrogate. And that child that was born through that surrogate would legally be your child, would legally be your heir. And so, all those same people that were saying, this is your fault, you must have done something for God to curse you, they probably would have been like, yeah, this is just what you do. Can't have kids? Yeah, you use a Hagar. The only problem with that is if you know your Bible, you know that you're not supposed to sleep with someone who's not your spouse. And Abraham knew this, but, it was accepted by society, so he's probably thinking it wasn't that big of a deal. And so what we don't see from Abraham is we don't see him protest, we don't see him put his foot down, we don't see him say, no, we can't dishonor God like this, or no, honey, we just need to wait. He'll make good on his promise. We see him passively comply, and he sleeps with Hagar, and she becomes pregnant. So let's see where that leads us. Playing God often leads to broken relationships. Let's see how the story continues here in Genesis 16. So Abraham had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abraham, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abraham replied, "Look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarah treated Hagar so harshly, she finally ran away. I feel like I've seen this reality show before. It's like soap opera, like reality show level drama, like bad. Who knew the Bible was the original MTV? So Hagar's pregnant. She's able to conceive. She's able to do the one thing that caused Sarah so much grief and so much pain throughout her life. And now that she realizes that Hagar sees she has a one-up on her mistress, she treats her poorly. She treats her with contempt. And so Sarah, even though this was her plan, goes to Abraham and says, "This is all your fault." And she completely forgets that this was her idea. She was the one that wanted to make this happen. Now, I think it's really easy to look down on Sarah for this, but I just want you to remember, back in Egypt, Abraham completely betrayed her by letting Pharaoh take her. And so she's dealing with a husband that's betrayed her once before. And now he's betrayed her again by sleeping with another woman. Regardless of the fact that it was her initial plan, there's a lot of blame to throw around. I love that she says, God will show us who's to blame, you or me. Well, it's both of you, Sarah. And then so Sarah returns to Hagar, and she ends up treating her so horribly that Hagar, a pregnant woman, decides to go out into the wilderness, that she'd rather go out there and try and make it on her own as a pregnant woman than spend another day with Abraham and Sarah. And throughout this whole thing, Abraham is totally apathetic. I love this translation because it's like, how many guys, when you're arguing with your wife, don't say the same thing? Look, this is not my problem. You go deal with it. He's completely apathetic. He has no remorse. There's no apology. There's no consolation to his wife. He just says, you deal with it. I don't want anything to do with this. He acts like he had no role to play whatsoever. So Hagar leaves, and eventually God calls her back. And so she comes back, but about 15 years later, she leaves, and this time it's for good. And as far as we know, there's no reconciliation between Sarah and Hagar. In fact, this feud between the two of them had such great repercussions that we can still see it today. In fact, Ishmael was the son of Hagar. And through Ishmael came Islam. In fact, the Islamic prophet Muhammad claims his lineage through Ishmael. And then through Isaac, the son of Sarah, comes the nation of Israel and Judaism. And those are two groups you can see throughout history. There has been feuds and war and bloodshed and death. And it all started right here between these two women. So you can see how far-flung this feud goes. Maybe if you know in the show Three's Company, the two cast members, Suzanne Summers and Joanne DeWitt, didn't talk for the last 3 seasons of the taping of the show. And they didn't talk for 31 years after that. So you can see that people haven't changed. We can still just be really contemptuous, ugly people. And it's because when we take things into our own hands and we try to play God with the promises that He's given us, we're going to end up hurting. You know, if you're waiting right now for God and you feel like you're waiting for Him to come make good on His promises, but you're thinking about cutting corners, I can assure you, you're only going to end up hurting yourself and those around you. If you're waiting on strength and you find it in a vice, you're going to hurt yourself. If you're waiting on justice, but you seek to enact your own version of justice, you're going to end up hurt. If you're waiting on wisdom or discernment and you look to the world for advice, if you're waiting for freedom from an addiction and you turn back for another fix, if you're looking for direction and you seek your own selfish way, I mean, there's 100 examples of how we can look to somewhere other than God. And there's 100 examples of how it's going to end up hurting us. And it's going to end up breaking the relationships around us. If we're looking to anywhere but God, then we're going to end up hurt. And so maybe some of you already feel like you're there. You're like, yeah, well, I cut some corners and I'm paying the price now. How long are you going to keep suffering? I mean, how long are you going to keep going and doing your own thing? How long are you going to go until you realize that God's way is the way that you need to go and that you surrender to His timing? The good news of today's story is that God didn't give up on Abraham and Sarah or Hagar. It didn't matter how badly they messed up because God was faithful, as He always is. See, what we're learning today is that waiting and trusting God enough to wait on Him is always the best option. Let's see how God comes through at the end of the story. The Lord kept His word and did for Sarah exactly what He had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. So 15 years after this mess, 25 years after God made His initial promise to Abraham of a son, Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is not far behind at 90. God finally comes through on His promise in a miraculous way. After a lifetime of waiting and hoping for a child, they're given their son. And just to give you a little picture of just what a joyful experience this was for them, they named their son Isaac. And Isaac literally means laughter. I mean, just what an incredible picture. I can almost see it on their faces. This old couple with a brand new son and the laughter and joy that they're experiencing. And then God continues to fulfill His promises by turning Isaac into a great nation, the nation of Israel, and we can see their story throughout the Old Testament. Now, to wrap things up, I just want to talk to 2 groups today. First group is if you are checking out Alpine Church, if you're investigating into what it means to have a relationship with Jesus, if you're trying to figure out this whole God, Bible thing, first off, we're glad you're here. Keep coming. You're in the right spot. But maybe you're in that spot and you feel like you're waiting. And maybe you don't know what you're waiting on. Maybe you feel like you're waiting on God. The last way that Abraham had this promise to him was fulfilled is God said, I'm going to bless the world through you. And we see that through the lineage of Abraham and Isaac and all the way down to Jesus. See, Jesus did what nobody else could do, and he died on the cross for your sins and for mine. I mean, it's something that we all have, something that we all do. We might not mess up as big as Abraham and Sarah, but we all make mistakes. The way we like to say it here at Alpine is whenever we choose to go our way instead of God's way. The Bible says that sin and that brings broken relationship and that brings death into our lives. And it brings a death into our relationship with God. It severs that relationship. But it also says that through a relationship with Jesus, through faith in his sacrifice on the cross, that we can have a renewed and restored relationship with God. So if you feel like you're waiting today, maybe your life hasn't panned out how you've hoped, or you're waiting for things to turn around. Maybe you're hoping to climb out of a depression, or maybe you're just trying to find your purpose in life. I can assure you that if you look to Jesus, you're going to start seeing answers. You're going to recognize that God has a plan for you, and it's the best plan out there. You're going to see all the promises that God gives to those that have faith in him, and you're going to find that purpose. That I can assure you. So I just want to invite you and encourage you that if you feel like you're not, maybe you don't even know how you feel about this whole God thing, or you're trying to figure it out, but you feel like you're waiting. I'm going to be up front after this service. There's going to be some leaders up front. Talk to the friend that brought you. Talk to any of us. We would love to explore that with you and to show you just the incredible plan that God has for each and every one of us. And we'd love to share you stories from the Bible and from our own lives of just how faithful he really is. The second group I want to talk to today is those that feel like they've been a follower of Jesus for a long time, and you feel like you're waiting on God right now. Maybe you're waiting to conquer a sin in your life, or waiting for strength in a hard time, or you've been honoring God, you've been telling your friends about Jesus, but you're waiting on any type of results or the fruits of your labor. I just want to encourage you with this. It's Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. One of my favorite things about a relationship with Jesus is hope. The nice thing about God is that he's the giver of hope. And so this verse encourages us, and I'm encouraging you today to hold tightly to that hope. Don't forget the promises that God has kept throughout history. If you need some reassurance that God keeps his promises, the Bible is full of stories. Remind yourself every day. Read those stories. Remind yourself of God's faithfulness. Remember all that he's done for you personally. Remember all he's brought you through. And most importantly, remember the cross. Hold tightly to that hope. And remember that waiting on God's timing, it really is the best option because he is faithful. He always follows through. So let's trust in his plan and his timing. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this story of Abraham and Sarah. That you took two broken, messed up people, and it didn't matter what they did, God, you were faithful to them. God, I thank you for the fulfilled promise of Isaac, but most importantly, through Isaac came Jesus, God. And I thank you for his life and death on the cross, God, that you sent your own son to do what we couldn't. And God, I think that you did that despite our brokenness and our shamefulness, God. I pray for anyone today waiting, God, that you would Reassure them of your faithfulness. God, I pray that you would give us a perseverance and a hope, that we would look to you, God, not to ourselves, not to our own schemes or corner cutting. God, that we would look to you and to you alone as our hope for salvation and as the keeper of the promises that you give, God. Be with us, Lord. Let us be hope-filled people so that others can see the promises that you make, God, and the faithfulness as you carry them out, God. We love you. We thank you. In your name, amen.